Hello everyone! Welcome to our animated philosophy series, where we explore timeless concepts in a modern context. Today we're going to tackle one of the more challenging but fascinating ideas in modern philosophy, Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox. It's part of his broader critique of how we think about language and meaning, but it focuses particularly on how we follow rules and whether our understanding of rules is ever really a private, internal affair. We're going to break this down, look at some examples, and hopefully by the end, we'll see why Wittgenstein thought that following rules, even something as simple as add to, is much more complicated than it might first appear. Let's start with a basic idea. Imagine a math problem where you're asked to count by twos. You start with 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. This seems straightforward, you're just following the rule add to. But Wittgenstein's question is, how do you know you're following the rule correctly? When I say add 2, how do you know that this means you should go from 2 to 4, then 6, then 8? Why isn't it possible that at some point you misinterpret the rule and instead go from 2 to 5 or from 6 to 12? The key point Wittgenstein is getting at here is that a rule, by itself, doesn't explain how to follow it. You have to interpret the rule each time you apply it. This brings us to the paradox. If every time you interpret a rule, that interpretation is just another action, how can we say you're ever really following the rule rather than just coming up with new interpretations each time? Are you memorizing the steps of the rule, or are you understanding it in a deeper way? And can that understanding be purely your own? To help illustrate this, let's take an example outside of mathematics, learning to play a musical instrument. Say someone is learning to play the guitar, but they can't read sheet music yet. They don't know any formal music theory either. What they do is listen to songs and try to replicate what they hear. Over time, they get better at it, and they can pick up on certain patterns in the music, chord progressions, rhythms and scales, even though they might not consciously recognize them as such. The question is, are they following the rules of music? On one hand, they seem to be following the rules of musical structure because they're playing lines with common patterns. But they aren't explicitly thinking about these rules. They aren't thinking, here I'm playing a minor chord progression, and here I'm switching to a dominant seventh. They're just playing. Are they really following rules then, or are they simply reproducing what they hear in a somewhat mechanical way? What's missing is any clear distinction between what they're doing, let's call it rule-following behavior, and what might look like mere imitation or habit. This is what Wittgenstein would call a shared social practice. The musician is part of a larger musical tradition, even if they don't realize it. They're not learning the rules of music in isolation, they're learning in a context where they're exposed to how other musicians behave and play. Over time, they become part of that practice, and their ability to follow the rules emerges not from internalizing the rules in a formal sense, but by participating in that musical world. Now, let's bring it back to language. Wittgenstein suggests that language works in a similar way. When you learn a language, you're not just learning isolated words and rules for putting them together. You're entering a complex, shared practice. And much like our musician, you don't have to be explicitly aware of every rule you're following in a conversation. The rules of grammar, meaning, and syntax are all part of this larger system, but we don't consciously apply them every time we speak. What you're doing is participating in a practice that gives those rules their meaning. Wittgenstein's critique here is aimed at the idea that understanding or following a rule can be something purely internal. He rejects the notion that there is some kind of private interpretation of a rule happening in your mind that guarantees you're doing it right. Instead, following a rule is something that happens within a community of speakers, within a shared practice. It's a public act. This also helps us see why Wittgenstein believed that rules can't have meaning in isolation. If following a rule was just a matter of interpreting something in your own head, there would be no way to check whether you're doing it right or wrong. But when you're part of a social practice, when you use language in shared ways, there are standards in place that guide and correct your behavior. Just like our musician, who learns through playing with others and hearing what sounds right, you learn the rules of language by participating in conversations and seeing how others react. So the key insight Wittgenstein gives us with his rule-following paradox is this: rules don't exist in a vacuum. You can't understand or follow a rule purely by thinking about it as an abstract idea. Rules are woven into the fabric of our social lives. They gain their meaning from the way we use them, together with others. Let's recap what we've covered. Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox shows us that the idea of following a rule isn't as simple as it seems. The paradox challenges the assumption that we follow rules by simply interpreting them in our minds. Instead, Wittgenstein shows that rules are part of shared practices. They're not about individual interpretations, but about participating in a broader, social activity. Whether we're playing music or speaking a language, the meaning of a rule comes from the way it's used, not from some hidden essence that we privately grasp.